All right, I'm back. I would like to talk about plot structure and how plot serves a story. You in your books should read, in your index you can look up plot, but I believe it is pages 85 to 92. Let me just double check that because I want to go over this with you anyway. 85 to 92. Okay, so essentially, plot is the arc of the story. It's the beginning, middle, and end, essentially, but it's not just a sequence of events. Your book does a really good job explaining this. What they talk about is, like, if I say, how did your day go? And you say, I woke up, went to work, went to eat with a friend, and came home. There's no plot there, right? That is a sequential reporting of your day. And I believe your book, or our book, talks about this as action. So the actions of your day sequentially reported on and like a timeline is not a plot. A plot is something that has a shape and a story and a little bit of a conflict and like actually an arc that moves a story forward, right? So let me read what the book says because the book says it in a more concise way than I will. All right, so if you are reading with me on page 85, we're going to skip down to the second half of that page, plot versus action, sequence, and subplot. And I just want to read this whole section because I think the clarity with which the book expresses these ideas is pretty profound. The term plot is sometimes used to refer to the events recounted in a fictional work, but in this book, we instead use the term action in this way, reserving the term plot for the way the author sequences and places the events so as to shape our response and interpretation. So it's not just a list of the things that happen. The difference between action and plot resembles the difference between ancient chronicles and that merely list the events of a king's reign in chronological order and more modern histories that make meaningful sequences out of those events. As the British novelist and critic E.M. Forster put it, the king died and then the queen died is not a plot, for it has not been tampered with. When they say tampered with, they mean bringing in some twist, some level of interpretation that allows you, the reader, to have interpretation, right? That allows you to kind of create an understanding of what's happening below those events that are just happening, right? Like if I said I woke up today and I had coffee and then I came home, what you're missing from that is that I woke up, had coffee, had to bring my car in to get fixed, and then finally got home because I had to borrow someone else's car, right? And if I even put in a different order those same events, you'd have an even more interesting story, right? Like here I sit with the keys of a car that don't belong to me. We could open that way, and then I'd go back and tell you the story, right? That would be plot. So when they say tampered with, they mean kind of a lens of interpretation brought in. The queen died after the king died describes the same events, but the order in which they are reported has been changed. The reader of the first sentence focuses on the king first, the reader of the second on the queen. The second sentence, moreover, subtly encourages us to speculate about why things happened, not just what happened and when. Did the queen die because her husband did? If so, was her death the result of grief? Or was she murdered by a rival who saw the king's death as the perfect opportunity to get rid of her too? Though our two sentences describe the same action, each has quite a different focus, emphasis, effect, and meaning thanks to its sequencing, the precise order in which the events are related. So plot is all about establishing sequencing that may be linear, maybe like on a timeline, but may not be, right? And establishing a relationship between events that cause the reader, us, to ask questions, to bring our own interpretation. Going back to Rosenblatt's theory, the plot is really where we start to connect our own understanding of the world that animates the plot and the story. Well, the story really, the plot helps us animate the story because we have these opportunities to ask these questions or to create these relationships between seemingly unrelated events, right? Like chronicles, what they mean by that is I don't know, the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a chronicle is a collection of works. It could be historical, often it is, or it could be fictional, as with the Chronicles of Narnia, but it goes in a linear way. Like chronicles, many fictional works do relate events in chronological order. That's where chronicles come from, the word chronological, so in order of the time when it happened. Starting with the earliest and ending with the latest. Folk tales, for example, have that sort of plot, but fiction writers have other choices. Events need not be recounted in the particular order in which they happened. Quite often, then, a writer will choose to mix things up, perhaps opening a story with the most recent event and then moving backwards to show us all that led up to it. Still, other stories begin somewhere in the middle of the action, or, to use the Latin term, in medias res. I don't know how to pronounce that. Literally in the middle of things. In such plots, events that occurred before the story's opening are sometimes presented in flashbacks. Conversely, a story might jump forward in time to recount a later episode, or even a flash forward. Foreshadowing occurs when an author merely gives subtle clues or hints about what will happen later in the story. Though we often talk about the plot of a fictional work, however, keep in mind that some works, especially longer ones, have two or more. The plot that receives significantly less time and attention than another is called a subplot. All right, so I especially want you to think as you do the reading for this week, which is the Amy Hempel, The Harvest, the story The Harvest by Amy Hempel, and then which is The Secret Life of Walter Mitty by James Thurber. As you're reading both of those, you're going to be really thinking about the earlier video where I introduced you to this concept of the unreliable narrator, thinking about both the characters, Walter Mitty and the woman in The Harvest. Do we believe them? Do we trust them? But I also want you to think about plot, right? We're about to look at a very traditional plot structure by a man named Freytag, I think is how you pronounce that. And the stories I'm asking you to read actually don't exactly follow that structure. And I want you to think about why the writers, James Thurber for The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and Amy Hempel for The Harvest, why those writers have chosen to kind of mix up events, to be kind of unsteady in their representation of what's real and what's not real. Because you get a really interesting change from a traditional beginning, middle, and end story with a traditional arc in both of the stories I'm asking you to look at. So you're going to be really thinking about plot through these two unconventional plots. We'll get right into more traditional plots immediately after. So you'll have two things to kind of measure them against, or you'll have these two unusual stories to measure more traditional stories against. Okay. Let's talk a bit about pace. In life, we sometimes have little choice about how long a particular event lasts. Not so with stories, right? So with stories, you can move around in time while still establishing a plot, even a traditional plot structure. And you can collapse time, and you can take more time on an event. Those moments in our lives that seem to last forever but are really only a second long, like you fall in love the first time you see that person's face, right? Or you get terrible news. Maybe you hear the news actually in time as it passes in maybe 30 seconds. But for you, whether it's elation or sadness, time stretches out, right? So one of the most beautiful things about writing is that we get to play with time as writers, and as readers, we get to experience that expansion or that contraction of time through a story. I'm not going to go over piece by piece the pacing, but it's important, so go ahead and read that section. Let's go down to, okay, so we're going to go to Freytag's pyramid, and I want you to study this. I'm going to also I linked a resource, and I'm going to link another little short video about it that's clearer and quicker than this one. But really what you have is exposition, which is sort of the explanation. It's like laying down the foundation as things begin, right? You might get a little bit of setting. You might get a little bit about who the characters are, names, ages, at the beginning of the story. Then we have the inciting incident. So this is the thing. Our character is plodding along through their normal life, right? The inciting incident breaks up that normalcy, right? And interrupts them just enough for us to have suddenly a plot. After the inciting incident, you have rising action, right? The rising action is where things are building up, and this interruption, this inciting incident, is becoming more and more important, or its impacts are becoming more and more clear. The climax, which often is where we also get conflict. Often the climax is driven by conflict, by two things that are in conflict with each other, or two characters that are in conflict with each other, and that's where you get the words antagonist and protagonist. Real quick, a protagonist is our main character. An antagonist is sort of, doesn't have to be the bad guy or the enemy, but often that's how it's represented. But it's sort of the person who is causing tension or conflict or struggle for the protagonist. In a traditional love story, that's kind of an on and off again. The lover, one of the lovers, might be the antagonist to the protagonist, right? So there's lots of different options there. But often the climax comes because there's conflict. Sometimes there's an antagonist that moves that conflict forward. After the climax, the big fireworks, then you have your falling action, then you have your resolution, right? So there's maybe nothing gets solved in the story, but there's usually some place where the writer creates kind of a foundation for us to land on as readers. So maybe it's a lesson learned, right? Or maybe it's a revelation, like beyond a lesson, just a realization about the world. It's some kind of aha moment. And then we slowly move to our conclusion. And Freytag put it in this shape because we have steady, 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 interruption, rise in action, fall in action, and then steady, steady, steady to conclusion. All right, so that's your traditional structure. Most things do follow this structure. If you look at any Disney film, any Shakespeare play, comedies and tragedies, they're all going to follow this pattern. Again, Amy Hempel's piece and James Thurber's piece that you're reading does not follow exactly this, but I think you can find the elements of this in the story, and I'd be interested to see how you do. Is there anything else we want to talk about with plot? I don't think so. I think I want you to read the rest of this. In addition to the discussion questions I'm going to provide, I would like you to ask any clarifying questions you might have after reading this whole section on your own about plot. When you ask those, I will do my best to go over and answer them. Only ask a question if you have one. If this makes perfect sense to you, you don't have to weigh in. This is not a discussion. It's an open forum for questions on the discussion board. So I will provide a space for that. Go ahead and throw a question up there if you have one. I will answer it, and then we can all answer it for each other as well. All right, I think that's all I have to say about plot. Like I said, I'm going to attach several other things in case this video is not as clear, which it's certainly not concise. So if me talking through ideas works for you, this is how I would be teaching in person, by all means use these videos. If not, I'm usually going to try to put in auxiliary content that's shorter and already exists. So if you don't want to listen to me, you don't have to. Well, if it's not useful for you, don't. But if it says like introduction to something or announcements, like you should, I guess. I just made that more confusing. Can I edit that out? I don't even know if I have time to edit right now. I'm falling asleep.